So how do you know whether the beginning of your novel works? Well, this video is kind of like a test for your novel, and if you run it through all 9 of these considerations and your novel beginning hits all 9 of them, well, there's a good chance that you have a winner on your hands. Let's get started right away with number 1. There's a gripping story question. So a story question is just something that the reader thinks when they're reading the initial pages of your book. They have a question about what's going to happen in the future. And if you know what sort of story question your readers might ask, it's just a good shortcut to know that, oh, you're going to get readers to keep reading. Let's look at some examples like The Giver by Lewis Lowry. The question it asks is, why is this seemingly perfect society so rigidly controlled? I think readers are curious about that mystery and that they want to keep reading to find out the answer to that question. Or let's look at what the question would be for Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. One question is, what happened to Amy Dunn? That's very much a mystery. 2, is Nick telling the truth about his wife's disappearance? Now, if you can't come up with a gripping story question for the beginning of your novel, it might be a sign of one of these 3 problems. 1, you might be starting too slow. You really should have the story question arise in the first chapter. If you're waiting until chapter 3 or something, it's too late. 2, it might be a sign that you're starting in the wrong place. You want to start in the type of place that does raise a story question that the reader is curious about. And the third thing is, maybe you haven't figured out what this book is really about. And so you're too close to it and you don't know what the question is that your story is asking. And maybe you just need to keep on writing, and later on you'll be able to come back and ask the right story question. And if you know your story question, please leave it in the comments, and people, let's upvote the best ones. It's also important at the beginning of your book to make sure the reader knows whose story it is. So I want you to ask yourself right now, whose story is this? This book that I'm writing, who does the story really belong to? Often when I read the beginning of a book with a large number of characters in it, sometimes I'm left wondering, I don't know whose story this really belongs to. It can't belong to everyone. That's really not an option. There has to be at least one person that rises above the fray that is slightly more important than all the other characters in your novel. Now, if you're writing in first person, well, I mean, usually it's kind of obvious. It's the first person narrator, but not always, right? Think of like Watson and Sherlock Holmes. Watson is the first person narrator, but I think everyone thinks that this book is really about Holmes. But if you're writing in third person with a bunch of different character point of views, you might need to ask yourself a few questions to figure out who the main character is. One question you can ask yourself is, who changes the most? Whoever has the biggest character arc over the course of your novel, that's often a sign that the story belongs to them. Another good question is, what character starts and ends the book? These are very privileged positions. And so when you have a character that occupies that space, it's a sign, oh, this book is really about them. A third question is, what character will accomplish the central goal? The character who accomplishes the main goal of the novel often is the most important character in the book. Now, I know that the more characters that you have, the more difficult it becomes to answer this question. I know. But if you can't answer this question, you're often going to be floundering when it comes to basic structural questions like, how do I begin my book? How do I end my book? Or like a basic question like, what is my climax? And what are the roles that my character should play in that climax? Even by the end of a series like Game of Thrones, in which it seems that there are millions of characters, it still feels like the main characters are Jon Snow and Daenerys. So there's really no excuse. In your mind, you really need to know, who does this story belong to? Now, you also know that the beginning of your novel looks promising if, number 3, your protagonist has clear stakes. The reader should be able to answer what happens if your main character fails, both in terms of external stakes, do they survive, or is their main relationship ruined, but also a sense of their internal stakes. If they fail, do they lose a sense of their own identity, or do they feel like they're completely morally bankrupt? And you also need to have clear stakes set out from the very beginning of what happens when your character actually succeeds. What do they get? What do they earn? What's the payoff? Now, if you don't have a good answer in the beginning of your novel for what happens if the main character succeeds or fails, then usually it means you haven't started the story fast enough. If you are waiting for a third of the way through your book or halfway through the book to finally tell the reader like, oh, these are the high stakes of the story, I think that's much too late. For an example of this, let's look at The Secret History by Donna Tartt. In the first page and a half, I kid you not, the first page and a half, she has very clearly laid out the stakes of this entire extremely long novel. The external stakes are really clear. If the police are able to pin the murder on them, they will all go to jail. But I think the internal stakes are communicated just as clearly. If he can't get over this murder, then this is gonna haunt him, and he's not gonna be able to go on with his life. And by the way, please like this video because it makes my heart very happy, and subscribe if you haven't, because people are always telling me in the comments like, you don't have enough subscribers. And I'm like, man, I haven't been even doing this a year, but thank you. I think that's a compliment, but you can help with that by subscribing. You also know the beginning of your novel looks promising if, number 4, you use a mix of showing and telling. So you've probably heard the advice before, like, oh, you should start with like a scene, you know, which is basically showing. And that's not terrible advice. I just want to expand your notion of what the novel can do. The novel is a very expansive form. You can take a lot of different approaches to it. And so I don't want to make you think like, oh, I have to do all showing in my first chapter. No, I mean, I think it's just as easily, you could do a mix of showing and telling, any sort of mixture. You could do 95% showing and 5% telling. You could do half and half. And for an example of this, let's look at The Hobbit by Tolkien. The first few pages of this book are telling. He's telling us about this hobbit and what his hole is like and what the Shire is like. And then the book transitions into showing, where we have Gandalf come along and talk to Bilbo, and they blow smoke rings, and Gandalf invites him on an adventure. So please, please, please don't trap yourself into this little box of thinking like, oh, like all of my first chapter needs to be showing. I have to have lots of scenes. I think the advantages of telling in the beginning of your novel is sometimes it can accelerate our knowledge of a character. Like we feel we get to know them very quickly if you just have a couple lines telling us about who they are. I also think telling helps to orient the reader quickly. It also helps to pick up the pace at the beginning of a novel. And the pace is so important, especially at the beginning of a novel. Telling allows you to skip over the boring stuff and summarize it really quickly. And by the way, if you need more help with your novel, check out my course, Write Your Best Novel in Bookfox Academy. It's helped thousands of other writers, and I think it might help you too, so check it out. The 5th sign that you are starting your novel well is you sound like a person. So when someone begins a novel, they want to feel a voice on the other end of it, like a human voice. In other words, not an AI voice, not a nondescript voice, not a Wikipedia entry voice. You want to be a person on the page. You want to take your original voice and just cast it onto the page so that someone reading it could tell, oh, that sounds like so-and-so. So now it's time for a pop quiz. I'm going to give you a single sentence from an author, a sentence full of voice. It definitely sounds like this author. And your task is to tell me who it is in the comments. And because the voice is so strong in this single sentence, I bet most of you are gonna know who this is. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. So why is there so much voice in this single sentence? One, it's kind of confrontational. Oh, what? You want to know things about me? Well, you know what? I don't want to tell you. 2, it's kind of negative. There's words like lousy, there's words like crap, and he says like, listen, I don't want to talk. 3, I think it is very intimate. He is speaking directly to the reader. And then 4, there's this sort of swinging colloquialism about this. This is not highfalutin literature. He has phrases like, we're occupied and all. You know, it feels very almost slangy. Your goal in the beginning of the book, whether it's first person or third person really, is to come up with a kind of voice that is distinctive to you. So the reader can feel that it is a person telling the story and not a robot. And now it's time for the next way that you know your novel is starting off well. Number 6, each scene has multiple purposes. Single purpose scenes are a little bit like single purpose plastic. They are bad for the environment of your novel. Look, your goal is to have every single scene, especially the scenes at the beginning of your novel because they're so important. Your goal is to have them accomplish multiple things, not just one thing. A scene can advance the plot. It can develop character. It can accomplish world building. It can raise the stakes. So I want you to squint at the first, say, 3 or 4 scenes in your novel and be like, what are you really doing? Are you accomplishing multiple things? Because if not, maybe you need to combine those scenes, or maybe you need to throw one out and focus on the one that's doing multiple things at once. Let's look at the first scene in A Wrinkle in Time, written by Madeleine L'Engle. This scene is accomplishing so much. 1, we have character building. Charles Wallace is obviously way too smart for his age, and the way he speaks sounds like a 40-year-old, not like a youngster. 2, we get some plot going on. We have a stranger swing into the scene, Mrs. Whatsit, and it's revealed she lives in this haunted house out in the woods. And then 3, there's some world building because everyone's wanting to know what exactly is a tesseract. That's a scene that's accomplishing so much, and honestly, I could have probably picked any book off my bookshelf and looked at the first scene and realized how much work it's doing. So just check your first scene and ask whether it's accomplishing everything you want it to accomplish. Now, the 7th sign that the beginning of your novel looks promising is there's emotional friction. You know what? Readers gotta feel something. No amount of heady intellectual ideas can substitute for the heart. So just ask yourself really quick, when my reader finishes, say, chapter 1 or chapter 2, what is the emotion I want them to be feeling? If you can't come up with the answer to that question, it's a good sign that you've prioritized the puzzle-making pieces of your novel, setting things up, but you haven't yet engaged their emotions, and that's absolutely key to draw them into the story. Let's look at Bonnie Garmus's book, Lessons in Chemistry. Before Elizabeth Zott became a star of her own cooking show, she was facing this workplace sexism, and this is in the 1960s. We know that this character is fiercely intelligent, but she's not been given a chance to show off her intelligence. And so as readers, we feel an enormous amount of frustration with what she's suffering. Right away, we are emotionally on her side, sympathetic towards her. And if you want more about how to incorporate emotions into your novel, watch my video on why 90% of authors fail to connect with their readers. I talk a lot about emotional hooks and how to engage the reader's emotions, so take a look at that if you haven't already. I'll put a link in the description. And here is the 8th check for the beginning of your novel. You want to make sure that characters make meaningful choices. You want to make sure that your main character is actively making decisions that drive the story forward, and they're not sort of like sitting back passively and allowing the story to happen to them. Now, I know there could be a counter argument to this that says it's much more important at the end of your novel to make your character active rather than at the beginning of the novel. Beginning of the novel, they can be a little bit passive if something like happens to them, and then the whole novel is them figuring out what to do. Okay, I mean, decent counter argument. That is true. That's true. But I would say if it is possible in your story to make your main character active in the beginning, you should do it. You should take advantage of that. Let's look at Divergent by Veronica Roth. Tris has an enormous choice to make in the beginning of this novel. Will she stay with her family in the Abnegation faction, or will she instead choose the Dauntless faction? And because she worries that she's not selfless enough and that she has this very adventurous streak inside of her, she does make the very important choice to choose Dauntless. And I think the book would be completely different if she was just shuffled into Dauntless rather than being forced to make a decision. It gives her so much more personal responsibility. It definitely shapes her character. It creates a huge rift with her family because they feel like she's abandoning them. And it also creates this struggle about her identity. Who is she? Who is she as a person? So if it is at all possible, make your characters make an important and key decision at the beginning of your book. And last but definitely not least, number 9, the story promises what it delivers. Okay, this is not a throwaway point. You might hear that and be like, well, of course my story promises what it delivers. But I have to say that as an editor, many times I have read the first half of a novel and it is separated, radically separated sometimes, from the second half of the novel. Now, why does this happen so often? Well, novel writing is a long process, and over the course of that process, you change as a writer, you become a different type of writer, and often your vision for the book can sometimes change in subtle ways or in quite radical ways. So how do you solve this problem? Just make sure that if you set up a quest, then the rest of the book is going on that quest. If you set up an antagonist, don't drop that antagonist. Make sure that antagonist continues for the rest of the book. If you talk about an inner conflict in the first chapter or two, make sure that inner conflict is something that is haunting the character for the rest of the book. In other words, you're trying not to fake your reader out. The first few chapters of your novel are a promise to the reader. Hey, this is what this book is about. Do not break that contract. So out of those 9, how did you do? I hope you did pretty well. You got most of them, if not all of them. You can go ahead and post your scores in the comments if you want to brag or you want to lament. And please watch another of my videos to help you along the writing journey.